Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almasyan. Today I was checking the news, and apparently on the weekend, clashes erupted between Serbian protesters and NATO peacekeeping forces in Kosovo, and there are several, I would say tens of injured from both sides. And I would like to discuss this issue because there are so many incidents that when I'm analyzing the Syrian case, people come and tell me Syria is a perfect example also of what happened in Yugoslavia. They're trying to Balkanize Syria. And so I want to discuss this issue with Dr. Marcos Papadopoulos. He's a historian, political analyst, and an author. Thank you very much, Dr. Marcos, for being my guest. It's a pleasure to have you. You have a great knowledge on the international scene, especially in the Balkan region. So let's discuss together this issue today.
Certainly. And thank you, as always, Kevork, for giving me the opportunity.
Amazing. Actually, for starters, there are lots of people, they may not know or have a big historical context or historical knowledge on this conflict. What's the legal status of Kosovo? First things first, and why and since when NATO peacekeeping forces, quote unquote, are stationed in Kosovo, and why?
Allow me, first of all, Kevork, to set the scene, because the politics and history of the former Yugoslavia is extraordinarily complicated. So, in short, ever since the 5th of October of 2000, Serbia has been a colony of the West, because on that day, a nefarious and infamous organization by the name of Otpor, which was conceived, created, financed, led, and instructed by Western intelligence services, overthrew the Yugoslav president Slobodan Milosevic and handed Serbia to the West on a golden platter. What ensued after the 5th of October of 2000 was the destruction of the Yugoslav economy, by which I mean Yugoslav national industries. For example, heavy industries were privatized and then sold to foreigners, who then subsequently closed down these industries so that they could flood the Yugoslav market with their own foreign products. And then the natural resources of Serbia were pillaged by the Western ruling elites. Once again, these were privatized and then sold to foreigners. Then the Serbian culture was penetrated, whereby Serbia was flooded with Western cultural values, for example, Hollywood and things such as sexual depravity. So that is why Serbia is today a colony of the West. On top of that, the name Yugoslavia, or as it was at the time, Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, was dropped in the year 2003 by the Western ruling elites, because whilst they had already killed the country Yugoslavia, they wanted to kill the concept of Yugoslavia. Hence, they renamed the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia to Serbia and Montenegro. And then in 2006, the Western ruling elites held a sham referendum in Montenegro, where it is said by the Western ruling elites that the majority of Montenegrins voted to separate from Serbia, which, of course, to anyone with even an ounce of knowledge about Serbia and Montenegro knows that to be absolutely absurd, because whilst not all Serbs are Montenegrins, all Montenegrins are Serbs. So in effect, in reality, Montenegro was torn away from Serbia. And then whoever was prime minister and president was instructed by the Western ruling elites to degrade the armed forces of Serbia. So, under Slobodan Milosevic, the Yugoslav army, which was known as the VJ, was comprised of 120,000 soldiers. Today, the Serbian army stands at no more than 5,000 soldiers, possibly as low as 3,000 to 3,500 soldiers. Wow. All of the prime ministers and presidents and other members of the government, and indeed the members of the so-called opposition, are chosen by the Western ruling elites. So if we take the current Serbian president, who is only president on paper, he is merely a puppet of the Western ruling elites, one Aleksandar Vucic, he was chosen by Tony Blair to be president. Indeed, Vucic is a disciple of Tony Blair. After Vucic assumed power, he flew Tony Blair twice into Belgrade. Now, that is quite remarkable, given that Tony Blair is one of the worst enemies of the Serbian people in their history, because he was one of the main NATO leaders which took part in the criminal and murderous bombing of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia by NATO in 1999. And if we take Ana Brnabić, the current Serbian Prime Minister, who again is only Prime Minister in paper, she is also a disciple of Tony Blair, and he selected Ana Brnabić to be Prime Minister. Both Vucic and Brnabić are completely and utterly intellectually devoid. In short, they are nothing but dullards. However, from the perspective of the Western ruling elites, it makes absolute sense to put into power as your puppets two idiots, because idiots are easily manipulated, easily exploited. They care nothing for the country, they care nothing for the people, they are guided only by money, materialism, and status. It would not make sense for the Western ruling elites to make someone as president in Serbia someone who is intelligent and strong-willed and patriotic. So if we turn to Kosovo today, I should start first of all by saying its proper and historical name is Kosovo and Metohija. The so-called Republic of Kosovo, which unilaterally declared independence in February of 2008, is an illegal entity, because according to international law and the United Nations resolution covering it, Kosovo and Metohija is an integral part of Serbia. It's no one else outside of Serbia has jurisdiction over this ancient Serbian province. But, alas, international law, the United Nations Charter, means nothing to the Western ruling elites, by whom I mean, of course, the Americans, the British, and the European Union. Kosovo, the so-called Republic of Kosovo, is in effect a NATO colony. And as a result of the Americans and the British and the European Union elite controlling the so-called Republic of Kosovo, they have cemented Western dominance of the former Yugoslavia of the Western Balkans. So if we turn to the present, we see reports of violence in northern Mitrovica between Serbs and NATO, so-called NATO peacekeeping forces. Again, NATO is an illegal occupying force. There is no legal jurisdiction for NATO to be in Kosovo and Metohija. And I must also say, Kevork, that the largest overseas American base in the world is in Kosovo and Metohija. It is called Camp Bondsteel. At a minimum, there are 6 6,000 American soldiers there. The figure could be as high as 8,000 or 9,000 US service personnel stationed there. Now, these clashes, which we have heard about in recent days, have been engineered by Vucic and his partners in Pristina, the so-called Albanian government of the so-called Republic of Kosovo. Why has he engineered these? Because the West's grip on Serbia remains quite weak, because the vast majority of Serbs are opposed to Western liberal cultural values being in Serbia. They are also opposed to how Kosovo and Metohija has been torn away from Serbia and made independent by the Western ruling elites. And then also the vast majority of Serbs loathe with a passion NATO because of the criminal and savage war from the air which NATO waged against Serbia in 1999, which I must say not only contravened international law and the United Nations Charter, it also violated NATO's own founding treaty, specifically Article 2, which stipulates that the Western military bloc will never use force to resolve a dispute. So, because the West's grip on Serbia is weak, and because this is being aggravated more and more because of the war in Ukraine, and because most Serbs are supporting the Russian military campaign in Ukraine, the Western ruling elites have instructed Vucic to engineer clashes between Serbs and NATO forces and Albanian forces in northern Mitrovica, for Vucic to say to the Serbian people, I am a strong and patriotic leader who loves Kosovo and Metohija and who will never stop fighting for Kosovo and Metohija. And therefore, I have deployed parts of the Serbian army to the border with Kosovo. He has done this on numerous occasions, but nothing ever comes of it. The Serbian army never crosses into Kosovo and Metohija because Vucic is a puppet of the West, because Serbia and the so-called Republic of Kosovo are allies, because they are both Western colonies. So Vucic attempts to depict himself as a strong patriotic leader by sending elements of the Serbian army to the border with Kosovo and Metohija. But then what does he do? He goes on television to say that he is speaking with Serbia's partners in the European Union and in NATO as to how to resolve the crisis. So he's talking to NATO and the European Union, who are tremendous and bitter enemies of the Serbian people, the very people who bombed Serbia and tore Kosovo away from Serbia. So it is just an act. It is a smokescreen that Vucic has engineered. This happened at the beginning of the year. It happened last year. And going forward, it will happen again. But let's just say, hypothetically speaking, Kevork, that the Serbian army, all 5,000 of them, were to leave their barracks across Serbia and enter Kosovo and Metohija. Well, what would they do there? Because they would immediately be confronted by the US military. It is preposterous nonsense to sincerely believe that the Serbian army, which stands at 5,000, which doesn't provide enough boots to its own soldiers, so that Serbian soldiers have to leave their barracks and go to local markets to buy boots for themselves, are going to enter Kosovo and Metohija and confront the US military. No. Again, it is a smokescreen to try and appeal to the Serbian people so that Vucic can say, I'm a strong and patriotic leader and I will never stop fighting for Kosovo. Well, if he wants to fight for Kosovo and Metohija, then he should expel from Serbia each and every NATO supervisory office which has a presence in each and every key Serbian state institution, such as the presidential office, his own office, the Serbian Defense Ministry, and the Serbian Foreign Ministry.
Wow. Dr. Papadopoulos, you gave a very, very comprehensive historical context, and you linked everything with what happened currently during the weekend with the clashes and the role also of Vucic in this. I would like to know a little bit about the conditions of the former Yugoslavia, the economic situation. Like, I'm not an expert on this issue, but I was reading that one of the incentives for NATO bombing of Yugoslavia was that Yugoslavia was turning into an economic powerhouse in the center of Europe, and this was also posing some threat on the German industry. So, how was the economic situation before the NATO bombing, and how the Serbian and the Kosovo, or let's say how the Kosovan economy looks like today? Because 25 years ago, for some time, there are NATO forces, there are EU observers there, and they say they are there to advance democracy, human rights, and build a transparent economy in Kosovo.
Let me clarify, first of all, there were three Yugoslavias. The first one was the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, which succeeded the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Then there was the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which lasted from 1943. It came into practice in reality in 1945 and lasted until 1991. That was Tito's Yugoslavia. Then in 1992, there was the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which comprised Serbia and Montenegro. That is something which, when I have been on television debates before in the past, I have had to explain to so-called experts of the Balkans, including British diplomats, the difference, because one British diplomat did not know the difference between the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. But let's start with Tito's Yugoslavia. So in 1991, the West encouraged secessionism in Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia to break up the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Why? Well, in a nutshell, the Cold War had come to an end. Soviet communism had collapsed in Eastern Europe. Therefore, the West no longer needed the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. And at the same time, whilst the Soviet Union in 1991 was on its deathbed, the Western ruling elites were very aware that in the future, Russia could become strong again. And they did not want, firstly, a socialist country with a socialist economy in the new Europe. And they did not want a future Russia to establish influence in this country. Remember, the Serbs and the Russians are historic friends and allies on account of Pan-Slavism and their Eastern Orthodox faith. So the Western ruling elites, starting with the Germans and the Austrians, broke up, encouraged secessionism in Austria and Croatia. And then the Americans encouraged secessionism in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So they killed the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Then in the late 1990s, they turned their attention to the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which, as I said, comprised Serbia and Montenegro, Slobodan Milosevic's Yugoslavia. Again, they did not want a socialist country with a socialist economy in Europe, even though it was a much smaller Yugoslavia than Tito's Yugoslavia. and also because Russia in 1999 was on its hands and knees. It was in political, economic, military, and societal meltdown, but nonetheless, the Western ruling elites felt that still in the future, Russia could become strong again and gain an influence in the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So they encouraged secessionism in Kosovo and Metohija by recognizing an organization which they had previously categorized as a terrorist organization. And I'm referring to the so-called Kosovo Liberation Army, which dealt in drug smuggling, gun smuggling, and organ trafficking. And they armed and gave intelligence information to the so-called Kosovo Liberation Army to battle the VJ, the Yugoslav army, and the Yugoslav police force in Kosovo and Metohija. By the start of 1999, the Yugoslav security forces had all but destroyed the so-called Kosovo Liberation Army. Enter NATO. NATO began its cruel and criminal bombardment of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which included NATO dropping depleted uranium on Serbia and Montenegro, and also on Kosovo and Metohija, which has resulted in a massive increase in cancer rates all across Serbia, Montenegro, and also in Kosovo and Metohija. So the Yugoslav security forces in the summer of 1999 are forced to leave Kosovo and Metohija. Russia can do nothing for the Yugoslavs because, as I said, they were on their hands and knees then. NATO moves in. NATO turns it into a NATO protectorate. And from there, NATO organized crime, Albanian organized crime,
Yes.
and NATO form an informal strategic alliance. The next to feel the heat, so to speak, of this informal strategic alliance was the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, as it was then, because a couple of years after 1999, the so-called Kosovo Liberation Army emerged in Tetovo, in the western parts of the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. And NATO was behind that, and NATO presented itself as the peacekeeper, and it brought Skopje and the Albanians in Tetovo to the peace table, so to speak, where in reality both of them were their allies. And Greater Albania has in effect has devoured another area in the Balkans, namely Tetovo, in the western part of the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, which is now known as North Macedonia. But returning to the so-called Republic of Kosovo, it is a major hub for organized crime, drug smuggling, gun smuggling, organ trafficking. It is known by Interpol officers and other police officers in the region and the wider world as the Republic of Heroin.
Which is, up until this moment, it's still active in the Kosovan economy. All these gangs are still harvesting organs. They're selling it around the world. Last week, there was a speech by a German politician under the German federal parliament, the Bundestag, and he was mentioning after he is talking about the German taxpayer money, that they spend billions of dollars, also other allies in Kosovo, and the promises were that they're going to push forward the democracy, rule of law, and the flourishing economy, but the reality on the ground seems otherwise. Gangs are very active. Economy is based on cronyism, clientelism. There's a high level of corruption and criminal activities. So we have all this chaotic situation, let's say, in the region. If I want to ask you the last question in short, what is the solution in your opinion for the tensions first to decrease, and secondly for the region to flourish?
economically speaking, the former Yugoslavia, from Slovenia to Croatia to Bosnia and Herzegovina to Montenegro to Serbia to North Macedonia to Kosovo and Metohija, is devastated. The Western ruling elites have raped the economies and the natural resources of the former Yugoslavia. They have, to a very large extent, devastated the culture of the former Yugoslavia, flooding it with Western liberal decadence, for example, in the form of Hollywood violent films and other forms of sexual perversion and decadence. The former Yugoslavia is controlled by the Western ruling elites, but their control over the Serb part of Bosnia, Srpska Republika, the Serb Republic, their hold over Serbia and their hold over Montenegro is weak. And the only way that the Serbs in Serbia, in Srpska Republika, in Bosnia, and of course the Serbs are Montenegrins, all Montenegrins are Serbs, can regain their freedom and protect, safeguard their cultural and spiritual values is through a revolution. There is no other way around that, because as each day, week, month, year goes past, the Western ruling elites are weakening the Serbian national conscience. So it is futile for Serbs in Serbia to think that if we replace Vucic or if we replace Brnabic, then we will have achieved something major. No, Vucic is merely a puppet. Yes, he's vile. Yes, he's a moron. Yes, he's one of the worst traitors in Serbian history, but he's still just a puppet. If he's replaced, if he's forced to go, or if the Western ruling elites feel he's too damaged, they will simply replace him with someone else. So Serbs should not be focusing their efforts on Vucic. They must focus their efforts, their time on the system, on Serbia's status as a colony, because this October it will be 33 years that Serbia has been a colony of the West. So again, there is no point in Serbs taking part in parliamentary or presidential elections in Serbia, because all of the parties on the ballot papers are controlled by the Western ruling elites. And that applies to the so-called opposition parties. So Serbs must rally. They must gather in large numbers. They must defy the Western ruling elites through their puppets in Belgrade and protect their culture, protect their religion, and say no, 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 no to everything that the Western ruling elites through their puppets in Belgrade say. The Serbs must know, and they must come out and oppose how Serbia has been supplying military equipment to the Ukrainian government, like how, Kavuk, the Serbian government, via Saudi Arabia, supplied weapons to Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria when both of those vile, putrid organizations were fighting against the Syrian army. Well, again, Serbs need to know that Serbia, let's be more precise, the Republic of Serbia, which is a political, economic, military and cultural entity created by the West, is again supplying weapons to an ally of the Western ruling elites to fight against the Russians. The Serbs and the Russians are a fraternal people. They are historic friends and allies. And yet, Kavuk, not a lot of Serbs are aware that Vucic is supplying arms to the Ukrainian army.
Dr. Papadopoulos, I will also mention last information just before we end up this conversation. I didn't know about Vucic supplying weapons through Saudi Arabia to Al-Qaeda in Syria during the war, but also I want to mention this information. I have met with a person in Armenia, Yerevan recently, and he was doing business with Ukraine during 2014 and 2015, and he was called to the embassy, and because of his usual business relationship, let's say, and he was offered by the Ukrainian embassy to deliver arms to Syria, to smuggle arms to Syria. They told him, you are a Syrian, you have the means to deliver, you have the big trucks that we know, you can deliver these arms, and we can facilitate this with the Turkish intelligence agency so that you deliver these arms to the terrorist groups. Of course, they don't call them terrorist groups, right? They call them freedom fighters, but we all know who are these people on the ground and where these weapons were dumped at the end of the day. So, different countries who had no direct role in the Syrian war, but just because they are puppet governments, as you mentioned, and puppet politicians, to Washington. And in Washington, it's also, they have their masters, right? So we have to always investigate and see who are these people benefiting from this war. But up until then, I really wish that peace prevails in the region, and also the Serbs understand the true nature of this conflict, and also try to change the system, as you mentioned. But if we want to tell the audience about your books, Dr. Papadopoulos, you're also preparing a new one, and you have an old one. Where can they find your books, and what are they about if they want to search and find your books?
Yes, my first book, which was published in 2021, is called Arise Russia, The Return of Russia to World Politics. It is a history of the demise, or the dissolution, I should say, of the former Soviet Union. The Soviet Union never collapsed. The Soviet Union was dissolved, and dissolved by three treacherous Soviet politicians: Boris Yeltsin, Leonid Kravchuk in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and Stanislav Shukevich in the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. So that's the first part of Arise Russia. The rest of Arise Russia is a presentation and analysis on contemporary Russian foreign policy. That can be purchased via Amazon or via the publishing house, or indeed via myself. I have a new book which will be shortly published. I unfortunately cannot disclose many details at present about my forthcoming new book, but I can say that it concerns the Soviet armed forces in the 1930s and in the 1940s, and that, in effect, it is a handbook on the Russian military. So if someone wants to understand how Russia makes war, historically, and the present day in Ukraine, then I would suggest to them they read my new book, because, as I said, it is a handbook on the Russian military. It is a handbook on how Russia makes war. The Russian approach to war is historically very different to how the West wages war. The Russian approach to war traditionally is an enigma to the West. And one of the reasons as to why the Western ruling elites are failing to understand just how potent the Russian campaign in Ukraine has been thus far is because the Russians make war very, very differently. But again, that is what my new book will be about. It can be bought again, or you will be able to purchase it again via Amazon, or via the publishing house, or via myself. As soon as it is published, I will make a note of this on Twitter, and also on Facebook. And if you don't mind, Kevork, I will send you also an email containing a description,
Definitely.
full description of the book and links to the book.
So guys, what I'm going to do now, I will put the Twitter link of Dr. Marcos in the description below. Please follow him for the update about his new book. His 2021 book, Rise Russia, The Return of Russia to World Politics. I will put the link now in the description below so that you can purchase it if you like. And about his future book, when he publishes it, I will notify you again, and I will put it again in the description below on the new videos. But till then, follow him on Twitter so you can stay in touch. Dr. Marcos Papadopoulos, thank you very much, really, for giving me your time and dedicating this time to explain to us this historical context and try to draw parallels between the past and the present so that I understand and the audience of Syriana Analysis understand what happened in the past few days with these clashes with the NATO forces there. Thank you so much.
I thank you, Kevork.
Thank you very much, guys, for watching. If you're new, please consider subscribing, share this video with your friends, and hit the like button. And if you want to support my independent commentary work, you can become a patron. Link in the description below. And see you next time.